לא לדאוג, נכון?
Hello. Okay, תודה. Dear friends, dear friends and colleagues, I'm excited and honored to open the 7th International Conference on Teacher Education, the Story of Innovation in Teacher Education. The story of innovation in teacher education, in addition to the story of this conference, is a story we author together, collaboratively. However, there are some authors who deserve special acknowledgement. I would like to thank Mr. Eyal Ram, the Deputy Director General of Teaching Personnel at the Ministry of Education, and a former teacher educator himself, for sustained support of teacher education and democratic values. Many thanks to our honored guests and keynote speakers, Professor Merlin Cochran-Smith, Professor James Banks, Professor Maria Flores, Professor Khalid Arar, Supreme Court Judge Emerita Dalia Dorner, Professor Miriam Ben Peretz, and Ms. Adi Nino Greenberg. I would also like to thank the discussants, Professor Michal Beller, the president of Levinsky Academic College, Professor Tamar Ariav, the president of Beit Berl Academic College, Professor Yael Kimchi, acting rector of Levinsky Academic College, and Professor Lily Orland Barak from Haifa University. We are all looking forward to their presentations. I'm grateful to Professor Roni Lidor, the president of Wingate Academic College, and the Forum of Academic Teacher Education Colleges Presidents for his long-standing support of the conference and for the physical activity sessions you are all invited to enjoy. We are also grateful to Levinsky Academic College for its generosity in sharing its facilities with us. We couldn't do it without Levinsky's auditoriums and spaces outside. Some teacher educators just showed up and offered tremendous help. I would like to thank Dr. Rhonda Sofer from Gordon Academic College and Dr. Manal Yazbak Abu Ahmad from Sakhnin Academic College for making the connections with Professor Banks, the American Embassy, the European Union delegation to Israel, and with members of the Erasmus Plus Cure Project. Professor Yael Fisher from Achva Academic College, Professor Mira Karnieli from Oranim Academic College, Dr. Rinat Arviv Eliashiv from the Kibbutzim Academic College, and Dr. Oded Mekdusi from Mufet performed the reviewing process and program construction. I'm sure many of you saw Professor Yael Fisher's video instructions on the conference's site. This conference takes place at the Mofet Institute. All of its staff volunteered to make it happen and have spent countless hours and are continuing to do so in order to make you feel at home. I would like to thank the board of directors for their firm support, Dr. Michal Golan, the head of the institute, and Mr. Yaakov Ender, our accountant. Mr. Sharon Greenberg, together with Dr. Elaine Chotter from Talpiot Academic College and Ms. Ruth Solomon, who will take you into the future of pedagogy with augmented and virtual reality workshops. The Israel Defense Force donated an educational escape room. Ms. Sigal Karni is responsible for advertising and public relations. We are grateful to her for bringing you here. Mr. Manny Meshulam is responsible for the infrastructure. Mr. Yoav Rivlin and Mr. Nimrod Rogozin create and operate the conference site. And if you have any problems with the computers, Mr. Ido Anaf will help. Many thanks to Ms. Lita Mam for all the meals and refreshments, and to Ms. Olivana Elal and Josefa Basson for taking care of all your payments. I'm sure you all paid attention to our wonderful graphic designer, Ms. Orit Liederman. Chava Vilchensky is our hardworking and efficient language editor. 4 tireless power women organized this whole production. Ms. Shana Breisblatt, the head of the organizing committee, is the chief conductor of everything you see. Ms. Ruth Serlin postponed her retirement just for this conference. Ms. Lior Bar's creative ideas made innovation visible, and Ms. Tal Oren's patience and punctuality helped us recruit reviewers and host our plenary speakers. Ms. Neta Ben Shitrit, Ms. Tamara Shalom, and Ms. Debbie Yitzchak gave them their warm hands. I do apologize if I missed anybody. It is just due to excitement. Finally, I would like to thank you all, reviewers, chairs, presenters, and participants. We would not be here and we would not do it without you. Presentation times and abstracts can be accessed through the QR codes you see spread around. Just type in author's name and then you can receive presentation times and also abstracts. Please pay close attention to workshop presentation times since they are different from those of other presentations. And now I would like to invite Dr. Michal Golan, the head of the Mofet Institute.
I'm very excited. Good morning to each and every one of you. Sorry for the freezing cold weather. We imported it especially for the conference from Iceland. Thank you, Einat, for mentioning almost all the wonderful people who offered their help to make this event happen. I warmly and personally join every word you said. I am honored to open the 7th International Conference on Teacher Education, the story of innovation in teacher education. It is really heartwarming to see so many people representing so many countries who care about teacher education. It's past, present, and future. That means that there are so many people who dedicate their minds and hearts to the well-being of human beings as individuals and as members of society. It also means that we are all very thirsty for professional discourse and that maybe we did a good job. Time will tell. Out of all the options, we decided to call the conference The Story of Innovation in Teacher Education. We, the community of teacher educators, strongly and very objectively believe that every change starts either in early childhood or in teacher education, both cradles of future new teachers. Thus, we should constantly be thinking, researching, and trying out new ways of creating stimulating and thought-provoking environments for them. Future teachers will not be properly equipped without experiencing innovative teaching and learning throughout their own professional growth. Sorry. Somebody. In a research study conducted by Dr. Yael Poyas et al. For the Research Authority of Mofet some 5 years ago, we looked for innovation in teacher education in Israel, and the findings were not all that flattering. As Startup Nation, we are all aware of the fact that inventors and entrepreneurs do not hang around, and we usually hear about the 4% of Cinderellas and much less about the 96% who are deeply frustrated. Last month, the Israeli Council for Higher Education, together with the Ministry of Education, presented the draft of the new guidelines for teacher education for reference. The committee dedicated 2 years to study the field in Israel and wide world from researchers, experts, and practitioners. I guess the key principles underlying these guidelines are most relevant to our colleagues from all over the world, and with your permission, I'd like to very briefly share them with you. It might be some starting points for our formal and informal discussions during this conference. The first one, institutional flexibility, which means more autonomy, more contextuality, more responsibility, etc., but also a heavy and promising task to look forward and prepare for. Continuity of professional becoming and professional being of teachers, which calls for cooperation among different stakeholders in the different phases of professional development, collaboration with the department at the ministry and with teacher education institutions, some goal to wish for. Coherence of and within teacher education programs, which calls for the long overdue discourse among colleagues in the very same programs and for the co-building of the programs. Are we back to the good old days of holistic point of view? What a beautiful mountain to climb on. The fourth one is expanding possibility for combining related fields in the program, which calls for the breaking down of walls and barriers between closely related disciplines and adopting more interdisciplinary view of the program. What an important and complex attitude to cope with. The fifth is deepening and expanding the component of practical experience in all the learning trajectories, which means, first of all, expanding the community of teacher educators, leading professional development schools, and empowering all participants in that journey. Another promising channel just to weave in within collaborative teams. Equity of possibilities to offer programs for all teacher education trajectories in all teacher education institutions. That means, in many ways, giving up uniqueness of institutions, deepening competition among institutions, take a risk of small groups in each institute, and an urgent need to equip staff members with new era of expertise. Education is a long and winding road with green and beautiful hills as well as steep and slippery slopes. It would not be a cliché to say that every teacher and teacher educator should invent him or herself all the time. The exchange of knowledge, ideas, and best practices is crucial and vital for our personal and communal journey. And last but not least, last Friday, I attended the very exciting event of my granddaughter's graduation of school. It was brilliant and young and lively, etc. But there was a most bothering, not to say sad, thread crossing all the grown-ups' messages, starting with the mayor of Tel Aviv, through the school principal and the teachers. They all begged the young citizens to help protect democracy with all their young energy. I am afraid, or more so, I know that we are not alone in this bothering story. I'm absolutely convinced that this is our biggest challenge: to encourage free minds, to lead free, respectful discussions, and to make this world a safe place to live in. Some 2 years ago, in the ATEE conference in Dubrovnik, I listened to the keynote lecture of Professor Marilyn Cochran-Smith. And even though she spoke mainly about the USA system, it sounded most relevant to Israel and I assume to many other countries. I asked Marilyn if she would be willing to be our conference keynote speaker, and to my great satisfaction, Marilyn immediately said yes. Did I mention devoted community? Ever since, whenever we experience a crisis in our preparations, we said, but we can't back up now. We already have Marilyn with us. So, dear Marilyn, you are not just a loyal friend and a distinguished keynote speaker. You're also an anchor in our storms and in this conference. Thank you. May this gathering, you can clap your hand. May this gathering strengthen our communities, enrich our minds, and be the beginning of a great friendship. Thank you.
So, our next speaker is Mr. Eyal Ram, the Deputy Director General of Teaching Personnel at the Ministry of Education.
Good morning, everybody. Michal Golan and the wonderful staff of Mofet, Michal Beller, the host of this session and the head of Levinsky College. Some people say education is a local issue, but even before we start, we can see that teacher education throughout the world is currently at a crossroads, faced with many questions. How to attract high-quality applicants to the teaching profession? Should academic training be at the undergraduate or graduate level? What is the correct combination of theoretical and practical training? What should be the focus between disciplinary education and generic education? Does it differ according to age group? Do we need small teacher education institutions or only large universities? Should teacher education be uniform and across the board? Or is there a room for diverse and niche programs? In common with many other countries in the world, the state of Israel is grappling with these questions with comprehensive strategic programs. Just last week, we all got Tali's 2018 report. And I want to show you how much we have in share, how much is in common. And for the Israelis, it's also to also have some pride as well. So if you look here, it just came out at Thursday. I'm not sure who already have seen it, and I just put 4 or 5 slides that you can all go back and have more curious to see some more. So you can see that the teacher profile around the world, the Israel and the OECD, is quite the same. And Israel teachers are a bit younger. It's mainly because we have a lot of new teachers. The birth rate in Israel is very high. That's why we have a shortage of teachers as well. And so in Israel, the teachers are a bit younger, but it's quite the same. If we look here, you can see here on the blue bar, the percentage of teachers reporting that the area of teaching included in their formal training. And the gray, and you can see that there always a kind of decrease, a gap. The gray shows the percentage of teachers who felt prepared in this area of teaching when they started to teach. So it is included in the teaching, but there are always a kind of decrease. Now these are the figures of Israel. The OECD average is quite the same. I just noted that if it's 5% more or less, so more in Israel, so it will be in green, and less it will be in red. All the rest, we are quite the same as the average of the OECD. So you can see it on the subject matter, on the general pedagogy, PCK, teaching methods, and student behavior, and classroom management. You can see the figures. You can also see it on the teaching in heterogeneous class, monitoring the development and learning of students, teaching ICT, and teaching in multicultural and multilingual settings. So as Israelis, we can be quite proud that in most of the figures, Israel is a bit more than the OECD, especially in the feeling of preparedness when they started the education. And I think to all the people that works here in teacher training, that's a pride that we can share together. If we look on the teachers at the beginning of their careers, there is a huge gap between Israel and the OECD average. It's blue and gray. So if it's the official support and guidance activities, it's almost doubled. And if you look at it, did not participate in any support, it also goes to the same direction. But you can see that even if the support is kind of doubled in Israel, it's still very low. Only less than 50% of the teachers felt that they have some kind of mentor in the first years. In Israel, it's part of the agreement that everybody has to have someone, and they don't feel it yet. So that's something that we still need to work on. But the situation in Israel is quite good comparing to the OECD. And if we go to the professional development, so you can see that in most of the things, Israel is a bit above the OECD average, but we kind of share the same methods for professional development, especially the community of learners, the PLCs, that in the last years in Israel become more popular in Israel, and the online training courses, there is a big gap between Israel and the OECD average. So we have a lot to work together and to learn from each other, and I hope you're going to have a great time. Enjoy your learning. Thank you very much.
So, unfortunately, Ambassador Emmanuel Joffre, the head of the EU delegation to Israel, was unable to come. So I would like you please to welcome Ms. Maria Markowska, who will bring his greetings. Maria Markowska is a political officer at the delegation and a defender of human rights. Please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Michal Gonen, the head of the Mofet Institute, and Dr. Einat Guberman for inviting us today to speak at your conference. Regret very deeply, an ambassador regrets very deeply that he was not able to be here in person and deliver the greetings. But I still hope that you will enjoy what I'll have to deliver on his behalf. Let me say a few words about the relationship between the European Union and Israel, which is very solid, deep, and mutually beneficial. The EU is for Israel the biggest market for exports, its biggest trading partner, and it's also #1 destination when it comes to travels for the Israelis, thanks to the Open Sky Agreement, which was signed between the European Union and Israel in 2013. There are many collaborations and cooperations between the European Union and Israel. And of course, there is also in the field of education. We do, in the European Union, care about the future generations. Still, someone could have wondered, do we need cooperation and coordination with Israel in the field of education? After we saw also the great presentation from the OECD, we do acknowledge that Israel has a very well-developed educational system. Its quality is unquestionable, and it's illustrated with the huge number of Israeli high-level academics and researchers, the high number of companies and industries in the forefront of the technological development. And yet, since 2008, the EU and Israel are working together through the EU-funded programs in education and in the research and development. We started in 2008 with a program called Tempus, and we continued through Erasmus Plus and Horizon 2020, which are thriving in Israel. In a nutshell, the Erasmus Plus program is a program that supports education, training, youth, and sport in Europe and the partner countries of the European Union, which Israel is one of them. While Horizon 2020, probably many of you have heard about this program, is the biggest program of public funding for research and development that comes from the European Union to its partner countries. I think that right now, almost 50% of all Israeli higher education institutions has already participated somehow has been involved in the Erasmus Plus program in the past decade, being it at the institutional partnerships level or at the level of staff and student mobility. And I also don't think that there is a single higher education institution in Israel that has not heard or has not participated yet in the Horizon 2020 program. If you look at the numbers, between 2015 and between 2017, there have been more than 19 million of euros an overall funding for the mobility between Israel and the European Union in the framework of the Erasmus Plus program. Currently, we have 10 ongoing projects between Israel and European institutions, and since 2008, the Israeli higher education institutions has received more than 42 million euros through the EU-funded programs. We, the EU, we welcome very much the participation of the Israeli higher education institutions in the Erasmus Plus program. We are very happy because we also have a lot to learn from Israel. As I said, we acknowledge very much the great education system that is here in Israel. And also, we think that mutually, Israel has a lot to learn from the European Union as well. We're very happy that the higher education process in the field of teacher education that will be also presented here at this conference. We're very happy to see it here. But we would still like to have some more students participating, more teachers participating. And I can also say from my personal experience, I was also a beneficiary of the Erasmus program some time ago. Another example of the cooperation and coordination between the European Union and Israel in different fields, being it agriculture, being it environment, being it energy, but also education, comes in the form of bilateral tools called TIEGS and twinning. With both of these instruments, both of these tools provide a special framework to answer the Israeli request to support the approximation of Israeli laws regulations, quality standards, and best practices to the European ones. These tools are part of the agreed action plan between the European Union and Israel that was agreed in 2005. And Israeli ministries and public agencies can approach us, the European Union, whenever they seek what I mentioned before, the approximation and harmonization of the Israeli laws, regulations, quality standards, and practices to those already existing in EU member states. I can tell you that already now, more than half of Israeli standards are based on EU best practices. We have a very successful project in the field of education with regards to the approximation of our regulations and laws, which we launched last year in August 2018, together with the Ministry of Education. It's the twinning project whose aim is to develop the Israeli National Qualification Framework. Since 2008, we do have the European qualifications framework existing, and the framework has allowed the EU member states and the partner countries as well to facilitate learning and working mobility. What is a qualifications framework in our twinning project? It is somehow a translation tool which countries can use to understand the foreign qualifications, which are based on what someone has learned and not rather how many years someone has spent on learning. Currently, there are 39 member states and, I'll be finishing soon, member states and the partner countries. To sum up, very quickly, I would like to say that we do think that in creating the Israeli National Qualifications Framework will help us with greater matching of curricula, qualification with the needs and the opportunities also of the market. Having in mind that in Israel, you do have various existing education training sectors. And also what it will contribute to, it will contribute to further international mobility to and from Israel. So to sum up, I would like to say the major role of the education sector system that plays in the cooperation and coordination between the European and Israel should be underlined, and we're very happy to work with you also in this field. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ms. Markowska. It is now my pleasure to present Ms. Elizabeth Fritschle, the Cultural Attaché of the American Embassy in Israel. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. It is such an honor to be here with Dr. Golan, Dr. Guberman, Ayal Ram, my distinguished colleague, Maria Markowska from the European Commission. It's an honor to be here and address this group. You might say, why does the United States Embassy care about this particular conference? The United States and Israel are two very diverse, very complex societies, and we feel we have so much to learn from each other. And as you've heard other people say, education is really the foundation of democracy. We believe the Moffitt Institute is a wonderful resource for teachers and really contributes so much to a strong educational system here in Israel. The U.S. Embassy is pleased to support the conference because we're also involved in many other efforts with the Ministry of Education and non-governmental actors here in Israel. For example, last week I was at the Weizmann Institute. We brought in some mathematicians to support a very innovative STEAM project involving flexagons. We're also very involved, again, with the Ministry of Education in the Barnell project you might have read about in the newspaper last week that's bringing citizen science and more hands-on laboratory work for young people here in Israel, particularly in periphery communities that might not have the same opportunities as people in the city centers. We also support many shared society initiatives to promote mutual understanding and reinforce those shared democratic values that the United States and Israel have together. We also partner with many colleges of education, supporting the visits of American scholars and investing in conferences and programs. And I'd like to mention very briefly the work of my colleague, Eitan Schiffman. Eitan, do you mind raising your hand? He handles the think tanks and universities portfolio. He serves as our institutional memory at the embassy when the diplomats rotate through every couple years. So he's always a great resource for you if you want to engage in any cooperative programming with the embassy. And today I'm particularly pleased to announce that we brought in 2 distinguished professors from the United States to participate in the conference. Professor Marilyn Cochran Smith from Boston University and Professor James Banks, who's joining everyone from the University of Washington. They are both past presidents of the American Education and Research Association. So we're really looking forward to the exchanges that are going to take place. Because I'm a history buff, and I wanted to share just a quick comment. I wanted to share the words of the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who was a Virginia senator, a planter, an architect, a member of the Continental Congress. He was the ambassador to France. He was the U.S. Secretary of State. He was the Vice President of the United States, and he was the President of the United States. But towards the end of his life, he wrote his own epitaph, the words he wanted to be on his tombstone. And out of all of those incredible accomplishments, there were only 3 things he wanted to be remembered for. One was being the author of the Declaration of Independence. The other was writing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was a precursor to our Bill of Rights. And the final and most important thing he felt he should be remembered for was being the father of a public university, the University of Virginia in this case. But I think it just shows that core value of the importance of education. And personally, I am here to thank all of you because of my own family story. My grandmother was born in the Western Plains of the United States, and her family lived in a sod house, which means the only resources they had were to dig a hole in the ground. The walls were made of the dirt they dug out of that hole, and the small amount of lumber they held was used to reinforce the roof. She had very little educational opportunity. My mother wasn't able to graduate from university, but thanks to the strength of a public education system and the incredible teachers I had, I was able to pass the examinations for the U.S. Foreign Service. So I'm an example of the strength and the power of what you do. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Now the moment we were all waiting for has arrived. I'm honored to present Professor Marilyn Cochran Smith, who is famous for her scholarship regarding teacher education research, practice, and policy, and for her sustained commitment to inquiry-based learning and teacher education for diversity and social justice. She is a former president of the ARA, and last year she received the ARA Division K Legacy Award for her lifetime contributions to research on teaching and teacher education. Professor Cochran-Smith had published 10 books and over 200 articles and other academic publications. Her latest book, Reclaiming Accountability in Teacher Education, won the Critics' Choice Book Award from the American Education Studies Association and the ARA Division K Award for exemplary research in teaching and teacher education. The title of her presentation today is Democratic Accountability in Teacher Education. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
I don't think so. Yeah, let's put it. Good morning. I've had the very good fortune of visiting Israel 4 times previously, including 2 visits to the Mofet Institute. The first one was in the year 2000, when I was invited here by my longtime colleague and friend, Miriam Ben-Peretz. The second to Mofet was in 2007, when, and some of you will remember this, we went back and forth by bus between Mofet in Tel Aviv and K College in Beersheba. Do some of you remember that? Yes. I've also had 2 wonderful visits to Haifa to work with my good close friend and colleague Lily Orland Barak and her students and colleagues at Haifa University. So Israel really has a very special place in my heart, and I'm delighted to be here to be part of this exciting conference on innovation in teacher education. I also want to thank all the members of the conference academic committee and the organizing committee, especially Annette Guberman, conference academic chairperson. And finally, I want to thank Mikhail Golan, who has already told you, we were together at the ATE conference in Dubrovnik 2 years ago, and she invited me almost immediately after hearing me talk to come and speak about this topic today. So thank you very much. Since our time is very limited, I want to just jump right into my presentation so there will be time for discussion. But I want to start with 2 notes. My talk this morning, as you can see, is titled Democratic Accountability in Teacher Education. This draws from my recent book, Reclaiming Accountability, which I co-authored with 8 of my students, all of whom now have their PhDs and have gone on to their careers. So when I say this morning, we, most of the time I mean this group of co-authors, most of them are in that picture, but occasionally I might mean we, the larger teacher education community. I think you'll be able to tell the difference. Especially in the first part of this talk, as Annette mentioned, I will use examples from the US, and I'm talking primarily about US teacher education accountability. Our context in the US is, of course, not the same as the context in Israel. But we live in a globalized economy, as we all know, wherein teacher quality has been the focus of intense scrutiny for nearly 3 decades. And there have been many teacher education accountability and other reforms and initiatives worldwide. Given all this, I think you'll find many things to connect to and resonate with in what I'm going to talk about today. My talk has 3 parts. Each one is represented with a caption and a graphic to sort of help you know where I am in the presentation. In part 1, I'm going to present a framework for sorting out and analyzing multiple overlapping accountability initiatives. And then I'm going to use that framework to argue that there is a dominant teacher education accountability paradigm that is consistent with neoliberal ideology and top-down monitoring. I'm going to suggest that this is ultimately harmful to our work as teacher educators. In part 2, I'll propose an alternative, democratic accountability in teacher education, and I'll use the same framework to work through that. And finally, in part 3, I want to describe some promising practices related to democratic accountability and raise some questions about its feasibility. Now, what I'm going to say has a lot of parts, and it's fairly complex. So we've given you this handout that I hope will be helpful. The front of the handout, which I think is called An Accountability Framework, really goes with part 1 of what I'll be saying. The back of the handout, which is a comparison between the dominant paradigm and democratic accountability, goes with part 2. So I think there are some more here. So if maybe you could raise your hand if you don't have one of these, because there are more handouts here. And thank you to Mofet for making the handout. I think it will help people. So I'm going to go on with part one because, as I said, our time is limited, and you'll get your handout in just a moment. So let me start with part one. In the US and some other countries, there are currently multiple overlapping teacher education accountability and other regulatory policies and initiatives. To sort all of this out, our research group developed an accountability framework for teacher education with 8 dimensions: values, purposes, concepts, the diagnostic dimension, the prognostic dimension, control, content, and consequences. These dimensions cluster together to constitute larger themes and issues in accountability. The first 3 dimensions, values, purposes, and concepts, form a cluster that has to do with the foundations of accountability. And this is underlying ideas, ideals, aims, and ideologies that go with any accountability initiative or policy. The next 2, the diagnostic and the prognostic dimensions, form a cluster focused on what we call the problem of teacher education. This has to do with how teacher education is conceptualized and framed as a practice and/or policy problem, as well as how solutions to that problem are operationalized. The last 3 dimensions, control, content, and consequences, form the cluster that we refer to as power relationships in accountability. This really gets at the politics of accountability, including what expectations and evidence for claims are stipulated, who has the authority to stipulate them, whom they affect, and both the short and long-term consequences and implications of accountability policies. The contribution of this framework, I think, is that you can unpack the dimensions behind almost any teacher education accountability policy or initiative, and even many policies that don't have directly or only to do with accountability, using these 8 dimensions. Whether or not they're explicitly stated, in much of the rhetoric you can uncover these. Together, these reveal the theory of change underlying accountability policies and their consistency, or not, with the democratic project. So we used this framework to try to sort out and analyze teacher education accountability in the US. To do this, we started by identifying the 4 most widely publicized, highly politicized, and influential current national accountability policies and initiatives. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of these because I think you're probably least interested in the specifics of these accountability policies, although you'll see some connections, I think. So in the US, every one of the 50 states has its own accountability standards for evaluating and approving teacher education programs. But starting in 1998, there has been a very clear tug of war between the states and the federal government for control. In 2014, the Federal Department of Education proposed very controversial new federal reporting requirements that would hold teacher education programs accountable, every teacher education program in the country, for the impact of their graduates based on the test scores of the eventual students of those graduates. And then the idea was to judge the teacher education programs based on the impact of their graduates. These reporting requirements, as I said, extremely controversial, were finally approved in 2016 at the end of the Obama administration, but then almost immediately rescinded by the Trump administration. But that's not all we have going on in terms of accountability. In addition to state and federal accountability, we have a national professional accreditor of teacher education programs, CAPE, the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, and some of you know its predecessor, NCATE. You've heard of that. CAPE has a set of standards that in certain ways resemble the federal requirements that programs need to show their impact in terms of their graduates' impact on the test scores of their students. CAPE is not required in every state. It's required in 14 of the 50, voluntary in the others, but many institutions seek CAPE accreditation. All of those seeking accreditation have to meet those accountability requirements. But there's still more. Beginning in 2013, a private advocacy organization with no regulatory or professional standing in teacher education, the National Council for Teacher Quality, or NCTQ, began grading every U.S. teacher education program, A through F, according to its own standards, and then reporting those in the highly publicized U.S. News and World Report magazine, and then later on their own very widely disseminated website. I'm not going to go into any detail about this, except to say this grading had some surprising results, including for a couple of small institutions you might have heard of, Stanford and Teachers College at Columbia. They both received a grade of D from NCTQ. Just food for thought. Finally, there's also a major trend across many of the US states to require teacher candidates to pass a teacher performance assessment after they have completed everything required in their program in order to be certified as beginning teachers. The biggest of these is EdTPA, which holds teacher candidates accountable to another set of standards that has to do with classroom performance. Again, that's just a really quick overview. To analyze all of these accountability initiatives, and you can see them down the left-hand side of this slide, we collected and coded a repository of hundreds of policy documents and tools, position statements, media postings, and critiques for each of these 4 policy initiatives, and we analyzed each one going across our framework. Then, working at the cluster level of the framework, which you can see at the top of the slide, we looked across all 4 of these. Although there were differences, some of them important, what we found were core similarities and cross-cutting themes that collectively constituted what we call a dominant accountability paradigm. And I'm going to say a little bit about that. So in terms of core foundations, we found 2 pervasive values: market ideology on one hand and equity on the other. Now you'll see in a moment that these seemingly incompatible values actually aren't, given the particular view of equity that I'll say more about in a moment. Market ideology in teacher education can be summarized in 3 words that you have probably heard many, many times. Teachers matter most in students' achievement and in a country's international competitiveness. These words were echoed relentlessly across report after report, national and international, around the globe for many, many years. The logic behind the market ideology is very consistent. We live in a global knowledge society. This means a country's economic competitiveness depends on its human capital. It's a country's education system that produces that capital. And it's a country's teachers that determine the quality of its education system. If student achievement isn't world-class or is uneven across socioeconomic, ethnic, language, or racial groups, it's assumed to be the failure of teachers and teacher education programs. Some of the many problems with those assumptions have to do with the second foundational idea, the overarching goal of equity. Now, if we took a poll, I'm imagining that most people in this room would raise their hands in favor of equity. But when we looked beneath the surface of the policy discourse, it was clear that most US accountability initiatives were animated by what we called thin equity rather than strong equity. That is, they worked from the dual assumptions that the unequal distribution of teachers is the major cause of educational and social inequality. And they also assume that increasing the distribution of effective teachers will achieve equity without necessarily addressing the social and economic structures and systems that create and perpetuate inequality in the first place. Strong equity, which I'll come back to in part 2, assumes almost exactly the opposite of these assumptions. This notion of thin equity is really powerful because, of course, it's not called thin equity. It's just called equity. And so it gives the impression that equity is being addressed when, in fact, these kinds of initiatives actually mask the systems and structures that produce and reproduce inequity. What about the second cluster of dimensions, the problem of teacher education? With the dominant accountability paradigm, we found that the problem of teacher education was constructed in the US as the result of 2 major failures of teacher education. Now remember, this is how it's constructed. This is not what I am saying, okay. First, teacher education's failure to earn public confidence and to develop as a true profession. This was seen as primarily the result of teacher education's failure to develop and operate a system of continuous improvement based on systematic data and universal measures, cutting-edge assessments about impact and performance. Policy analyst Deborah Stone says that policy problems usually have narrative structures with identifiable heroes, villains, and victims. Stone tells us that policy stories are powerful because they persuade people both how to understand a problem and what to do about it. The dominant policy narrative about teacher education in the US generally goes like this. The pervasive low level of teacher quality threatens national economic security. The cause of poor teacher quality is poor teacher preparation. Policymakers and the public rightly mistrust the knowledge, methods, and the will of teacher educators because programs don't have reliable universal standards and performance data. The situation is dire. But the story goes on. We now have the technology to control the problem with rigorous national data systems, cutting-edge assessment tools, and sophisticated data analytics. With these, the problem of teacher education can be controlled. Good programs can be identified through these data systems and rise to the top. Bad programs can also be identified and either forced to improve or excluded. Across the discourse about the major accountability initiatives in the US, we found that the policy narrative was remarkably consistent. The villain was teacher education programs because they didn't have strong data systems that are required to be a true profession like law or medicine. The victims were school children and the public, and the hero was whatever policy or initiative would monitor and control the situation through data. The third part of the dominant accountability paradigm has to do with who should have the power and control over teacher education. A number of scholars have talked about internal and external accountability to get at whether the group in charge is internal or external to the group being held accountable. Here, there are also matters of voice and choice, whether the group being held accountable have a voice about standards and mechanisms of control, or whether they have the opportunity to choose to participate. With the deep mistrust of teacher education that we have in the US, it's not surprising that we found that control tends to be external to both the institutions being evaluated and the profession at large, with little voice or choice about participation. Now, this is a very quick overview. That's why I thought the handout would help. This brings me to part 2. To elaborate the democratic accountability paradigm in teacher education, I'm going to once again use the framework. With the dominant accountability paradigm, and this is on the reverse side of the handout, and I've given you a comparison there, which is really what I'm going to elaborate here. So with the dominant accountability paradigm, I argued that the foundations were market ideology and thin equity. With democratic accountability, values are derived from democratic theory and strong equity. Democratic education theory draws on thinkers like many of those pictured here. Since I don't have time to talk about all these, this was a quick way to give you an idea. A basic assumption is that in democratic societies, teaching and teacher education are values-oriented enterprises for the public good, rather than market-oriented enterprises based on individual competition for private goods. A major question here is what kind of democracy we're talking about. Passive forms of democracy don't do much more than protect individual freedom and property, which is fairly consistent with market ideology and fairly typical of many contemporary democratic societies. On the other hand, democratic accountability assumes that we need participatory, popular, community-oriented forms of democracy in Benjamin Barber's classic sense of strong democracy. Here it's assumed there is something called the public interest and the common good that is more than and different from the sum of people's individual self-interest. There's much more to say about this, but in the interest of time, in addition to strong democracy, the foundations of democratic accountability in teacher education are also based on strong equity, which has 4 core ideas as I've conceptualized it over many years, drawing especially on the work of Nancy Fraser, Ken Howe, Joyce King, and others, especially political philosophers who have theorized justice and equity. So the first of these 4 is redistribution. I mean by this the redistribution to all schools of teachers who are committed to working for social change and who know how to teach students not only literacy and numeracy skills, but also how to advocate for themselves, how to disagree, how to engage in democratic deliberation, how to respect the viewpoints of those with whom they don't agree. Second is recognition by teachers, school leaders, and policymakers of the school and societal structures and systems that reproduce inequity. This means that it's not just teacher quality policies that would need to change if we were going to really transform things. We would also need changes in education, housing, jobs, transportation, health, and early childhood services. This also includes recognition and representation of the values and knowledge traditions of minoritized communities in school curricula, in practice, and in policies. The third is reframing of powerful ideas related to equity, especially ideas about colorblindness and meritocracy, which assume objectivity and mask the structural, economic, and racialized nature of inequality within a discourse of individualism and equal access. Access is not the sole answer to the achievement of strong equity. As Joyce King reminds us, equal access to a faulty curriculum is not justice. And what she meant by a faulty curriculum was a curriculum that aimed for assimilation as its dominant primary goal and did not include multiple knowledge traditions. Finally is the idea of resolving tensions. This has to do with acknowledging the inherent tensions and contradictions among competing ideas about equity and trying to manage these concretely, although knowingly imperfectly, in local teacher education programs and policies. Next, with the dominant accountability paradigm, as I hope I made clear, the problem of teacher education has consistently been framed as the failure of teacher education to produce a competitive workforce because of the lack of sophisticated data systems and the mistrust of the public and policymakers. But from the perspective of democratic accountability, the major problem is the dominance of the dominant paradigm itself and the negative effects that that has had on teacher education and teaching. Following Angela Valenzuela, we see the problem of teacher education as the subtractive impact of the dominant accountability paradigm. In the US, this paradigm has prompted uniformity and compliance. It's redefined how teacher educators think about their roles. It's emphasized narrow test-based or performance outcomes. It's de-emphasized local knowledge and local communities. And it's reduced the spaces in teacher education for discussion, reflection, and action related to equity, social justice, and democratic education. With the policy narrative that supports democratic accountability, the villain, or at least one of the villains, is the dominant accountability paradigm itself. And the hero is certainly not more data, but the collective. That is, teacher educators working with teachers, families, communities, and all other stakeholders, including policymakers, to change the focus of accountability from tests, individual self-interest, and private goods to also include students' citizenship and civic participation, the public interest, the common good, and the community. This cannot be done just with teachers and teacher educators, but it also can't be done without them. The third aspect of democratic accountability has to do with power relationships, especially control. Here we propose the concept of intelligent, professional responsibility in teacher education. And this is derived from our development and integration of three ideas: intelligent accountability, new external-internal accountability relationships, and the distinction between responsibility and accountability. Honora O'Neill suggested that what she called the intense audit culture in the UK public sector had actually resulted in lack of motivation, mistrust, and no actual improvement in people's work. She called instead for what she called intelligent accountability that begins with trust and with the audacious idea that the people who do the work in a particular area actually know something about that work and generally want to be better at it. The second idea, new external-internal accountability relationships, was elaborated by Michael Fullen and his colleagues when they were working on K-12 education. They said that in order to support teachers' learning and student learning, external policymakers should concentrate on creating the conditions for strong internal and local accountability for students' learning, rather than just monitoring and auditing. Finally, the distinction between responsibility and accountability has to do with the notion of obligation and imposition. Responsibility is chosen. Accountability is imposed. So we developed these ideas and integrated them with one another to create this idea of intelligent professional responsibility in teacher education. This is based on dialogue and on the participation of all stakeholders in the teacher education enterprise, including the participants in local teacher education institutions and programs who are being held accountable, but also including their students, the families and communities who work with them, and others. Dialogue, inclusion, and deliberation here are key. Intelligent professional responsibility leads to heightened trust, not mistrust, enhanced professionalism, and deep rather than superficial responses to evaluation. This brings me to part 3, promising practices. So far, I've been talking about a democratic alternative to teacher education in theory. But we need to do more than talk about things in theory. So in part 3, I want to briefly introduce some innovative programs, networks, and policies that suggest promising directions for democratic teacher education accountability in practice. You'll see that each example is in sync with one or more of the dimensions of democratic accountability that I've just been talking about, such as strong equity or intelligent professional responsibility. But none of the examples is completely consistent in every way with this new alternative that I'm proposing. Before I turn to these, I want to make clear that my use of promising examples is different from many other proposals for improving teacher education based on borrowing the practices or policies of high-performing or high-flying countries. The rationale for that kind of approach is stunningly explicit in the title of Mark Tucker's book about how to rebuild American education. The title of the book is Surpassing Shanghai. His agenda is very clear in the first few lines of the book, so I want to read those to you. This book answers a simple question. How would we redesign the American education system if we took advantage of everything that has been learned by the countries with the best education system? That question is important because a growing number of countries are outperforming the US on international comparisons such as PISA and PEARLS. And then Tucker goes on to give examples from these high-flying countries. Now, as I think is very clear, this approach to promising practices is based on market ideology, assuming that the purpose of teaching and teacher education is to produce a workforce that can excel in the global economy. Tucker's exemplars were chosen first and foremost because they came from countries with superior performance. My approach to talking about promising practices here is very different. In our book and this morning, I've chosen practices that show promise for strong democracy and strong equity, not for establishing a country's superiority in the global market. So I'm going to share 5 kinds of promising practices very briefly. I'll take these up one at a time. So first, our efforts to democratize teacher education at the level of local programs. As I've talked about, accountability expectations in the US are determined and monitored by agencies external to teacher education programs. Despite this, some teacher educators in some individual programs have worked to demonstrate knowledge and content, to democratize knowledge and content, or to make democratic education the centerpiece of the curriculum 4 very quick examples along the bottom of the slide. With the schools within the context of community program at Ball State University, which is in the state of Indiana, community mentors help teacher candidates learn about the funds of knowledge in children's lives outside of school. At the University of Washington, some teacher education programs feature field placements, not just in schools, but also in community-based organizations. A community family politics program is intended to shift power relationships by incorporating the knowledge of community members and families who are regarded and who function as co-teacher educators. A special education teacher education program at Lesley University requires teacher candidates to position the autistic students they work with as equals in the community. Candidates are evaluated in part on their ability to factor student voice into placement, program, and service decisions to align with the goals of democratic education. And finally, at UCLA, teacher candidates are expected to be activist, and they're evaluated on their mastery of activist skills in working with immigrant families and other minoritized communities. A second promising practice. So as I've said, most teacher education reforms include equity as a goal, but many are consistent with thin equity. One example of a program with strong equity goals is the National Exceptional Teaching for Disadvantaged Schools program, which began at a Queensland University of Technology in Australia. This program recruits top-performing students to work alongside teachers and families in historically marginalized high-poverty communities in rural and urban Australia. This local program has scaled up to 7 universities, supported by funding from the government and private foundations. And that funding was forthcoming because the programs had evidence that they had increased the number of high-achieving teacher candidates who chose to teach and stay in high-poverty, low-performing schools. In this program, teacher candidates have extensive coursework that helps them understand poverty from a perspective that rejects individualistic and access-based definitions of equity. And this program, I want to note, has now been carried along and revised into a new program by one of its co-founders, Joe Lampert, to La Trobe University in Victoria, Australia, where it's now called the Nexus program. Here's a third promising practice. This is from the state of New Hampshire in the US. The New Hampshire Institutions of Higher Education Network is a voluntary consortium of all 13 teacher education programs in that state. The group was founded and is run by teacher educators themselves, explicitly to put aside competitiveness, build trust, and get to know each other's programs. One of the consortium's key accomplishments is the development and statewide use of the New Hampshire Teacher Candidate Assessment of Performance. And they developed this and adopted it explicitly because they wanted to reject a single measure, high stakes, top down, and externally controlled state policy, such as those that are in place in many other states. So the group in New Hampshire really took back accountability. Here's promising practice number 4. Founded in 2016, the Education Deans for Justice and Equity, or EDGE, is a nationwide alliance of deans and former deans of education schools intended to advance equity and justice in education by speaking collectively and in solidarity with communities regarding policies, reform proposals, and public debates. EDGE's statements about democratic education were signed by more than 200 deans and by other civil rights, multicultural, and fair testing advocacy groups. The group's first official act was a New York Times open letter that sharply criticized a previous Times editorial because it had praised proposed federal teacher education reporting regulations. The letter asserted that the Times editorial was rhetoric-based, not research-based, and that the editorial presumed without evidence that teacher education programs were mediocre and underperforming. My last promising practice, this comes from Norway, my Norway friends who are here, whereas, and you can correct me later if I've got any of this wrong, in Norway, starting in 2017, a national reform requires that all teacher candidates for primary and lower secondary schools have to earn a master's degree and complete a master's thesis. The Norwegian Agency for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, or NOKUT, is the group responsible for evaluating the implementation of the reform and auditing the compliance of all of the higher ed institutions where they have teacher education. In an unprecedented move, NOKUT established an international advisory panel, which I have had the opportunity to chair, to help ensure that this teacher education reform was successful. Although I cannot claim that our advisory panel or NOKUT had the wisdom to do this from the beginning, over time, we developed an approach that has, to a great extent, reinvented NOKUT's role in teacher education from an external auditor and compliance monitor to an external agency that is working with the institutions and the panel to create the conditions for strong internal accountability, at least in terms of this reform. I cannot say anything about other reforms. So our model over 3 years has been participatory and collaborative, inclusive, and rather than a compliance-oriented approach, our approach has tried to be enhancing the capacity for agency, empowerment, and autonomy at the local level. I'm at the conclusion now. You remember that the title of this presentation is Democratic Accountability in Teacher Education. If there were a subtitle, it would be Now More Than Ever. And I want to say just a few words about that. In the US, we have an administration that favors the privatization of education and a market-based voucher system focused on many non-public school options, including for-profit arrangements. We have a billionaire Secretary of Education who has no experience as a student, teacher, or parent in public schools, and who has demonstrated a great lack of knowledge about education. But we also have way bigger problems and deeper fault lines that are not unique to the US and were not invented or introduced by the Trump administration, although they may have exacerbated them. Across many developed countries, we have growing, and in some cases, intergenerational income inequality and serious gaps between historically privileged and disadvantaged groups in both educational opportunity and educational outcomes. We have the emergence of a strong conservative nationalism. We have a backlash against immigrants and immigration policies. And we have the acute polarization of people who are animated by deeply dissimilar views, including some people whose values are defined by intolerance, even hatred, of conflicting viewpoints and those who hold them. Now more than ever, we need democratic education and democratic accountability, which are indispensable to the future of our democracies. I want to make one final point. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting we reject accountability. I think accountability has a place and always will have a place in education and in teacher education. Rather, I'm suggesting that we need to reinvent it, consistent with the democratic project. In short, I'm suggesting that we reclaim teacher education accountability as a lever for reconstructing its targets, purposes, and consequences. Now, I'm using the word reclaim here very intentionally. Many definitions of the word focus on getting something back that was previously lost or denied, like reclaiming the throne, or something that was temporarily separated from the owner, like reclaiming your luggage. But definitions of reclaiming, if you read far enough down the page, also include the idea of rescuing something from an undesirable state, or reforming something from wrong or improper conduct. My use of reclaiming to talk about accountability is closest to this latter sense. I explicitly want to rescue teacher education accountability from its current immersion in market ideology and the human capital paradigm. These zero in on teacher quality, narrowly defined, based on the assumption that boosting teacher education quality will not only boost the quality of the schools, but also the nation's place in the competitive global economy. I want to rescue teacher education accountability for democratic education, which not only prepares students for participation in democratic deliberation, but also identifies and works to eradicate the structures and systems that produce and reproduce inequity. In closing then, let me be clear. I'm taking the stance that accountability should serve democracy. And I think we should work from that stance to remake teacher education now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I would like now to invite our discussant, Professor Michal Beller. She was the head of the National Institute for Testing and Evaluation, founded by 6 universities to facilitate student admission process. Later, as an associate professor at the Open University, she founded and directed the Shoham Center, which integrates technology and learning. Professor Beller was the senior research director in the Research and Development Department of the Educational Testing Service in Princeton. She established and headed the National Authority for Measurement and Evaluation in Education, and currently she's the president of the Levinsky College of Education. Thank you, Professor Beller.
Thank you, Einat, and thank you for organizing this wonderful conference. I think you appreciated everybody's work, but not yours, so we should really applaud. So thank you, Professor Cochran-Smith, for your brilliant presentation. I read your book, and it's written beautifully, but also the presentation was something else. I read the book, and I would like to join the reviewers at the back of the book. I'll read just one review. This is a book every teacher, educator, and dean of school or college of education needs to have on their bookshelves. It should be at the center of teacher education conversations everywhere. And there are many more wonderful reviews, but this is just one. So I'll start by saying that here in Israel, we often copy what's happening in the United States for better and for worse. And it's true also to some extent for the K-12 education system. But when I started thinking about this presentation about accountability in higher education, I should say that it's not the same. It's not clear what it is, and I'll briefly describe it and then open the whole thing for discussion for everybody. But I'll describe it briefly, how it happens here. The higher education in Israel is much more centralized. The institutions of higher learning in Israel are all under the umbrella of the Council for Higher Education. The Council for Higher Education is the official authority for higher education in Israel, and it determines policy for the higher education system. All academic colleges of education are regulated academically by the Council for Higher Education. The Planning and Budgeting Committee, the PBC of the Council for Higher Education, is responsible for funding the Israeli system of higher education. However, most academic colleges of education, 21 out of 25, are still budgeted directly by the Ministry of Education. There's a slow, gradual move of these colleges to the sole auspice of the Council for Higher Education, slowly gaining more autonomy and seizing the dual subordination to two governing bodies, the Ministry of Education and the Council for Higher Education. What are the frameworks and guidelines for teacher training programs in Israel? In 2006, the Council for Higher Education appointed the Ariav Committee to set a new uniform set of guidelines for all existing teacher education programs. These guidelines require programs to contain three distinct components: a dominant disciplinary one, a pedagogical component, and a school practicum component. All academic teacher education programs need to abide by these regulations. As mentioned before, a new committee, Vadmani and Bar, is currently struggling, I would stress, with drafting an update to the Ariav Committee guidelines. So what are the powers of the Council for Higher Education? The main powers, and I will not list them all, is to grant permission to open and operate higher education institutions, accredit institutions in higher education programs, authorize accredited institutions, etc., but it also is responsible to conduct quality assurance and quality assessment of the institutions. The quality assurance system at the Council for Higher Education, which was established in 2003, is entrusted with preserving and fostering quality in higher education institutions as an essential national and academic priority. Until 2015, the quality assurance system, for historical reasons, did not include the academic colleges of education, the teacher training colleges. In 2015, the academic colleges of education joined the QA system, and in 2016 underwent the first process of evaluations. Since then, they underwent annual evaluations, one subject field per year, and have become full members of the National Quality Assurance System. To a great extent, the process of quality assessment and assurance is based on self-evaluation within and by the institutions. The internal evaluation process is an integral part of the activity plan of each institution, and the institutions are expected to operate a mechanism for carrying out this task. Currently, quality assessment and assurance in higher education system in Israel is carried out at the study program level. However, as I understand, there is an intention to upgrade it to the institutional level. Evaluating programs of study. Study programs at all levels in a given academic field will undergo a quality assessment process once every 6 to 8 years. A single external committee is appointed by the Council for Higher Education in order to examine all study programs by reading their, and meeting with them, reading their self-assessment. The aspects and topics to be examined are the following: goals and aims, and here I would put also the values and the visions of the institutions and the programs, the study program, its content, structure, and scope, teaching and learning outcomes, students, research, human resources, infrastructure, and the self-evaluation process itself, as well as other issues that the committee decides to look into. So far, the following BEd, Bachelor of Education programs in academic teacher colleges, underwent quality assurance: early education, Hebrew language, English as a foreign language, and in the near future, sciences and special education. There is no requirement to link K-12 student test results to the quality assurance process in teacher education accountability system. I'd like to stop here and to ask you, Marilyn, where would you put it in your framework, what we do. Is it okay not to link? Is it not all okay not to link? And then open this question and any other question to the audience. Would you like to respond to this?
This points out very well, I think, the fact that there are differences between the U.S. context and Israel's context or anybody else's context, which I tried to say at the beginning. And thank you for sort of laying out that profile of what teacher education accountability looks like in Israel.
It's not even called accountability, it's called quality assurance.
What I think is interesting is that your process is not unlike some of the process we have in the U.S. So every state has to do a self-report, a self-evaluation every 5 to 7 years, which I think is very similar to what you just said, and then gets audited on that. There are some standards, which I presume you must have as well. Hardly any standards. Interesting. And then in addition, if in the U.S., if you're going for CAPE national accreditation, you do a self-report. So on the surface, I think the approaches of many countries look somewhat similar. That's one point. The second point is I can't place anything anywhere because you can only know the surface. I could only know the surface from what you just said. Our study was based on looking deeply beneath the surface. So beneath the surface of a self-report or a self-evaluation, what is really expected, what is really going on, what are the values, what are the forms of evidence that are suggested, required, invited. So I think it's a real difference between, here's a description of what we do for accountability. We could do the same for the US. And looking deeply beneath the surface, doing an analysis of discourse and what actually happens in practice. The third point, I think, I can't place Israel anywhere, but I do think that there are differences, only because I don't have enough knowledge. I do think there are differences across countries, some of which are highly centralized and highly controlled, some of which are centralized, but there is an opportunity for what I would think of almost as distributed leadership. So it's in collaboration with institutions, and some are fragmented, and that is the word I would use to describe the US accountability scene in teacher education. Also England to a certain extent, where there are a whole bunch of things going on, and as we have multiple levels as well. So I don't know if that sort of answered perhaps one aspect of your question.
What about test scores? We don't link from the two.
Good for you. That's my view. That's my view. I think it's problematic in many, many ways, as I said.
Stay here because we'll help people.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, we open the floor for any question, comment, whatever. Who wants to start?
They're going for their break. Oh, here's a question.
You? Yeah, please.
Firstly, thank you very much. Really, really interesting presentation. Great way to kick off. My question is to the subtitle, I guess. And I guess my question is just about time frame. Do you think that the approach to the implementation of such a framework would be more of an evolution from where it sits now, or a revolution that it needs to be implemented immediately?
I'd love to have it implemented immediately. I don't think that's possible. So my phrase, now more than ever, really refers to what I think is the precarious state of democracy in many countries around the world, especially the US, but in many other places as well. That's really what the now more than ever means. I think if we actually are to move toward any kind of more democratic approach, it will certainly take time. And it will take building on some of the individual initiatives like those I mentioned, as well as some forward-looking top-down approaches as well, because I think it'll have to come from the bottom up and from the top down. So the state of New Hampshire is an interesting example, even though it is a very small state, but at least it has made a beginning. So I think it will be, I don't think it'll be a revolution, but I hope it will be a process of transformation over time, with more and more collaboration, more groups coming together. In the US, we certainly have more and more groups who have raised questions about the impact of all of the accountability schemes that we have had, and that they haven't solved the problem, even if you go from that perspective. So I think maybe this is a time now more than ever, because there are cracks in the system, and there are lots of critiques, and there are lots of people who think we need to do something different.
We have time for one more question.
Here, back here.
I don't, you? Yeah, please, one more question, yeah.
In your lecture, you asked the question, what kind of democracy we are looking for? This is the important idea about your trying to achieve a saving for democracy. As Kuhn showed us in his book about revolution of science, we know that a paradigm we can change only if we deal with the general concept. And the general concept is democratic, not accountability, because accountability get the meaning from the general idea. The question is, why you don't try to deal with the paradigm of democratic?
Well, the book is about accountability. And we set out to write a book about teacher education, myself and my students, and about sort of the current status of teacher education and the many, many reform initiatives that were occurring. What we found by reading very widely as a group was that accountability was a major aspect of what was going on in teacher education in the US. So that was our intro into the topic. Teacher education accountability. We developed the idea of democratic accountability over time, well into our research for the book. So I think that we take on the idea of what we mean by democracy to a certain extent in 2 of the chapters in the book. But you're right, the book is not primarily about democracy. I'm not a democratic theorist or a specialist in democratic theory. So we use that theory, I think appropriately and I think constructively, to help us rethink teacher education accountability. And the question of the paradigm of democracy really does matter in the book, because so much of what we call democracy these days is really about people voting in elections and trying to select the interest groups that will forward their own self-interest. And if that's what we mean by democracy, and if that's the kind of democracy we're talking about, it's not going to be any different. So that's kind of how we started and how we got, I think, to the place that we were. But you're right, it's not a book about democracy. It's a book about teacher education accountability.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Marilyn for an inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Very good.
Thank you.
A1.
המושבים המקבילים יתחילו בזמן, אז אנא בבקשה תתקדמו.